Hey everyone, in this fourth video on our series on the publication cycle and peer review, we are actually finally going to focus on peer review. I mentioned it a few times earlier in the other videos, but peer review is really the essence of how we as academics and as scientists ensure that our studies, our work follows certain rules, certain principles, certain guidelines, stays innovative, but also stays ethical. So peer review is also a very controversial topic, not so much as that we don't want to peer review articles, but how peer review is managed. Currently, peer review, or let's put it this way, folks who do peer review do it free of charge, right? So if you're a assistant, associate, or full professor, that is most folks who do peer review for journals are in those positions, or there might be lecturers or adjuncts, and talk about this in a second. Adjunct meaning they get paid per class rather than a salary to teach a specific load of courses. It's part of a professor's job. So folks like that, submit papers, and once you submit paper to a journal or to several journals in a certain field, these journals then will also start tapping you as peer reviewers to review other work that's similar to yours or related to yours, right? Since you're somebody who has experience in this area. And the way that those who are asked to do peer review justify work on this is part of, and this is especially true for folks who are either on tenure track or tenured, so assistant, associate, or full professors. The way we can make this count as our work is we make it count as, apologies for that, we make it count as, sorry, my cat just walked over something here. This is always fun. Apologies for that. So you make it count as service, right? So a common way to think of the labor distribution of, let's say, an associate assistant professor is a certain amount of coursework, teaching, saying 30-40%, sometimes 50, depending on where you are. Another maybe 30, 20 to 40% for publication, and the rest is for service. And part of that service or part of the publication work is work that we do as peer reviewers for other journals. So there has been a lot of conversation lately about should peer review be compensated? Should folks get a certain amount of money, some compensation honorarium for doing this work? And there has not been any conclusion, and a lot of people feel very protective about this sort of honorary status. The reality is that we have, with a decline of tenured jobs in certainly humanities and social sciences, but also in the STEM sciences, we see more and more folks asked to do peer review who don't have that institutional support or protection even, or even the ability, the capacity to do these peer reviews, because their jobs don't allow to count for those. So that is something to keep in mind. But the institution of peer review is a overall, and certainly in the past 50, 60 years, very revered and honored way, and the common way that we evaluate each other's work. And I wanted to share a quote with you on peer review. Hold on, there we go. It's by Richard Smith, who was the editor of the British Medical Journal, a very high tier, super high impact journal in medicine. So peer review is a flawed process full of easily identified defects with little evidence that it works. Nevertheless, it is likely to remain central to science and journals because there is no obvious alternative, and scientists and editors have a continuing belief in peer review. How odd that science should be rooted in belief. So that's kind of a funny little quote. So when Smith talks about the defects, he probably doesn't think of the defects as much about the same defects that I was just talking about in terms of the compensation, but the defects in terms of ensuring accuracy and getting a quote unquote fair review. Most peer reviews are blind, even though there's a movement now to not have them blind anymore. And there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to it. And I'll talk about this a little later. But I think the defects that Smith is talking about is it is an imperfect system. Sometimes articles get rejected and really treated very unfairly by reviewers, or some reviewers make really hurtful and, I would argue, unprofessional comments about other people's work. And this can happen particularly when they're commenting on something that is not necessarily their primary area of expertise. I also find that from what I've heard and read and talked with colleagues of mine um, who identify either identify or racialize as Black, as Latinx, as Asian, as biracial, or folks who identify and or work on topics related to LGBTQIA plus issues or indigenous rights, tend to sometimes receive reviews that are clearly racist and prejudiced towards especially toward comments like, oh, this is such a niche topic, this should not be published in this major journal, find a journal on like gender indigenous studies or whatever. So those comments are frequent, unfortunately, and don't happen infrequently. And I think that's those are some of the defects, the nature and the quality of review and the tone of review at times. It can be jarring and hurtful and unprofessional. So, but let's look at peer review. So the way peer review works, and the first thing you'll do, of course, you select your journal. And then one thing that a lot of folks forget, and most journals still require this, is to write a cover letter for your for to the editor of the journal. You might wonder, why is Isabel talking about a cover letter and she's talking about peer review? I will tell you in a second. So bear with me, because there's a particular reason why I mentioned this here, not in another part of these presentations. You address to the editors of the journal, general info, type of article. There usually is a statement. If it's not a letter, it's probably in the form or in the program you submit your paper through. Everybody agrees it's published, yada, yada, yada. It's not being considered somewhere else, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later too. Briefly explaining why the article fits the journal, what's the article about, its contribution, a small paragraph. And then this is why I included the cover letter here. It is also an opportunity to identify possible reviewers, and more journals are actually asking about this specifically. So let me talk a little bit about this in terms of differences between disciplines. This is a very common practice in the STEM sciences to say these people would be great to review. On top of that, there's also I know of colleagues especially at UMB, either in medicine or in pharmacology, in School of Pharmacy and School of Medicine, as well as nursing, who even in the letters ask editors whom specifically not to ask to review the paper. There could be another lab or another research group that is in competition with you, and you're probably not going to get a fair review. Even though it is anonymous, folks can figure out, right, where some of the work is happening, especially if you're working in small niche fields, which most of us, or most scientists, let's face it, do these days, because we're so, science is so specialized, because we know it has specialized so much. And if you remember back to Module 1, Plavin-Sigray's study, I think that's, the fact that we have such specialized science and more jargon kind of speaks to this. So the cover letter is an opportunity to do so. As I said here, editors might or might not honor that request. That is always the purview of the editor. It is helpful, though, to identify folks who might be good to review, and it gives you also an opportunity to make sure that you have somebody, maybe not like your mentor or somebody who's like, oh, they want me to get published, so they're going to say yes no matter what. But you want somebody who's really going to be able to evaluate your work and give you the feedback you need to make this a better product in the revision process, right? Because that's what we're all about. We're about revising and growing as writers and thinkers. And especially if you're writing about a topic where you feel that your sort of average reviewer in this over general field might not do a good job, or might not be really able to to think through this more critically, suggesting folks for review is a very common strategy. This is something that is not practiced as much, or hasn't been practiced as much, in the humanities and social sciences. So some interdisciplinary journals might have a reaction to that. So if you're planning on publishing somewhere, you're not sure if you should recommend something, it's not specifically mentioned in the direction to authors, I would suggest, contact the editor and say, hey, listen, would you like me to suggest, we were planning on submitting blah, 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 blah. Would you like me to suggest some reviewers? And I'm saying this because right now, and this is, I think, a result of a lot of different things, but certainly related to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and people just being overworked, is that a lot of journals have real trouble finding reviewers. So suggesting somebody might actually be helpful to the editor. I don't think it's increasing your chances of getting published, but it is kind of it is a nice gesture. But if you're not sure if that's okay for the journal you're submitting to, contact the editorial team and ask that question. It's the perfect legitimate question to ask. So the process of peer review, right? So how does it work? And I don't know where the numbers here are out of order, so let me do this. Here we go. Authors prepare the quote perfect article. Of course, that's a sort of a, as I put it in quotation marks, nothing's ever perfect, but the article you're most comfortable submitting. You submit to the journal. Writing a solid cover letter is important. Editors solicit external reviewers, usually two, right? At major journals, editors triage rejecting outright some articles. It means we call those desk rejections. So the editor might quickly look at your cover letter, glance over your and maybe even read thoroughly your article, and right away, within like a day or two, sometimes within minutes, say no, thank you. I was reading something on a Facebook group called "Reviewer 2 Must Be Stopped," where somebody said, "Oh, I got a response within like an hour after submitting, or 2 hours," and they were telling me, "We have accepted too many. We can't accept any more articles from authors from this particular country where the authors were from, because we have published too many articles from this particular country," which I thought was an interesting reason. I don't know the context, I know the person's discipline or the journal I submitted to, but just wanted to share that with you. So that would be called a desk rejection. But usually, but if you go through that first hurdle of getting to the editor, and in smaller journals, they do it right away. Often they send it to usually 2 reviewers, and this is an old number, I think. 3 to 5 requests needed to find a single reviewer. So think about this, editors, and if you have an edited journal, which I have not, but I have a lot of colleagues who have and are, it's a lot of work to find reviewers, especially now. I want to say 3 to 5 requests, depending on the discipline, depending on the journal, might even be a higher number, right? That's why it takes sometimes very long. So then reviewers read and comment on the article, and they usually get a time limit. Please review this within blah, 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 blah time. Month, 2 months, usually a month is what I see a lot, and what I've certainly experienced. And then reviewers provide their review, and the editors send a decision letter and attach peer reviews. And if they're blind, they don't know who you are, and you won't know who they are. More and more journals, as I said earlier, now though, starting to publish, not just make the review process open, so the people who are reviewing know who you and your team are, and you will also know who they are, but they even publish on their journal, in the journal, publish who reviewed this article. The Frontiers Journal do this a lot. I read a lot of the Frontiers and Communication. There's a lot of great SciComm stuff in there. And I've seen, and this is something I've observed over the past few years. It always tells you the 2 people who have reviewed this article. I think it's great transparency, because even the idea of the blind peer review is that it decreases bias. But I'm not convinced that it really does. So there's a lot of things to be said about open review, where maybe people, or let me put it this way, sometimes the blind review can encourage people to say things that they might not say if they know that the other person will know who they are. Then you revise your response letter, resubmit, or decide to submit somewhere else, depending on the reviewers, and we'll look about this in a second. And then editors, once you revise, editors might right away decide, oh, yes, this is a great review, this is a great revision, thank you very much, we'll publish as is. Or there might be a second round of review, and there might be some back and forth with the editor on some things as well. And then, rinse and repeat, you do it all over again. But right, that's the cycle. That's what I'm going to talk about, the publishing cycle. This is the part of the cycle, once you have the article finished, that we go through and through. And just want to say this again, and as loudly and clearly and repeatedly. Rejection is part of the process. It is absolutely normal. We all go through it. People get rejected all the time. It doesn't mean that if you get rejected, you'll never publish. On the contrary, for every article that you publish, you probably have several, 4, 5, 6, 2, whatever number you have rejected. Don't respond to reviewers' comments right away. We'll talk about this in the last video about how to respond to reviewers. But just as a foreshadowing, give yourself some space, because the feedback can feel, how can I say this, personal. And it's not, right? I mean, it is, but it isn't. It is not you're being critiqued, it's your work. But of course, our work is often who we are. And sometimes the feedback is really unprofessional, so I give you that. But then, make a plan how to deal with the feedback, and how to do that we'll talk about in the next video.